Today we'll talk about language contact and contact languages, so basically covering chapters 4 and 5. So languages in contact. I have a PowerPoint and we're going to go through some of the basics about those, but basically when people who speak different languages come into contact with each other, those interesting things will happen, and those languages influence each other, and it's typically a very subtle yet noticeable trigger for change in languages languages come into contact. English is a result of a lot of contact with other speakers. If we go back to England, when the Vikings started coming, the Vikings brought their Scandinavian, North Germanic languages, their dialects, and then the Anglo-Saxons who had arrived there in 449 from continental Europe, and of whose languages English developed. When that variety of English, Anglo-Saxon or Old English, came into contact with the Vikings languages influenced English quite a bit. And then we had a huge other wave of influence coming from France after the Norman conquest, or Normandy to be more specific, northern parts of what is today's France. So we had the Normans coming to England and bringing their language, which was French, to England, and then we talked about this, that English was suppressed initially, even though it was the language of the masses, so we had an interesting power situation there. But anyway, the variety of English we speak today, and which is spoken in many other countries as well, it is a result of a lot of contact. And we have, for instance, plenty of French loanwords in English, and it's, if you look at French, a paragraph in French, you can pretty much understand quite a bit of it because we have borrowed so many French words, and that was after the Norman conquest specifically. And also English has simplified quite a bit in terms of its grammar because of the contact with the Vikings already. And always, when languages come into contact, we have a second language acquisition situation, and it's easier to acquire a language which doesn't have a lot of grammatical endings, for instance. So English got simplified in terms of its grammar, partially because of the contact with other languages. So things happen to the language itself. But if we look at the more here and now issue, when people who speak different languages come into contact, they have to cope with that situation. We talked about that last time. We talked about pidgins, and then pidgins developing into creoles. But if we think about bilingual people, multilingual people who share languages with each other, they have that register resource coming from two different languages. So depending on what their conversational goals are, they can switch between two completely different codes, two completely different languages. And the big question that we typically ask when we talk about different languages coming together, when we talk about multilingualism, bilingualism, and so on. And please keep in mind that multidialectalism and bidialectalism, they can be analyzed under the same framework. except that it's not so easy if a person switches between two different dialects or pulls from two different dialects for resources. Then, because the switching between two different dialects, that's not like, you speak first Standard and then you speak East Texan. It doesn't happen that way. It's much more gradual. When we look at bilingual speakers, or subtle in a way, because it's not like complete switch to different, because we're talking about the same language, it's still English. But when a bilingual person switches from one language to another, it's easier to notice, unless these languages share a lot of lexicon, for instance, which typically means that they are closely related. But not necessarily, even if you look at Latin and English code switching, written code switching, it's sometimes really difficult to know whether the preposition in, in, comes from Latin or from English, because it's shared by both. So those kinds of questions are really interesting. But this question here, who is talking which language to whom, when, where, and let me change the how to why, because that, of course, we can ask, how is the person speaking? Is it loudly, angrily? Is it using slang of that other language? But let me change that to why, because this is a really interesting question, and we don't usually have a clear answer to it. But we can kind of like post facto, after people have been drawing from two different resources, from the resources of two different languages, we can then, after that has happened, we can kind of sit down, I wonder why that person was using Spanish in this particular segment of the discourse, and then switching back to English, and then switching back to Spanish again. So the why is interesting. What are the conversational goals that can be achieved? And what is fascinating is that a lot of this is subconscious for the speakers themselves at that particular moment. So we'll talk about code switching a little bit, or multilingual discourse, as Wardha and Fuller today prefer to call it, and it's a justified term, because code switching, it means that you're kind of like entirely switching, but you may still be using some resources of that other language as well. So in early code switching research, code switching, CS, is defined as or separated into two different kinds of code switching, both either situational or metaphorical. Situational code switching, and we'll look at more of those speech situations that we started last time. Situational code switching is, for instance, if I am speaking as a bilingual speaker, if I am speaking in Finland to my fellow old country people, the Finns, I will use Finnish because that's the situation. Then I come back and I enter the customs. I'm not going to try to aggravate the customs officials by continuing to speak Finnish to them, because I can draw from my resource of English. And so this is just a simplified situation, but you can see that would be the situation that defines. If I'm speaking to Finns, I'm speaking in Finnish. If I'm speaking to Americans, I'm speaking in English. Except if I'm speaking to Finnish Americans, I may draw on both of the resources and use code switching. But code switching can be situational, and also it can be metaphorical, and that happens when people are bilingual multilingual, and they use one language or the resources of one language as a metaphor for something, like identity, bonding. And that would happen in the conversations of, for instance, my conversations with other American Finns. So metaphorical code switching and situational code switching, I don't see this as a very important distinction, because metaphorical code switching is determined by situational factors as well. Who the participants are, what my conversational goals are. So in a sense, metaphorical code switching can be like, you know, a subcategory of situational code switching. Situational code switching being defined by the concrete situational features, like where I am, who I'm talking to, and what the topic is, and so on. But metaphorical can go under situational if we expand the definition of speech situation, like to include our identity marking, our conversational goals, other non-concrete conversational goals. We'll talk a little bit about code switching versus borrowing. It's summarized in that handout that I gave to you, the two-sided handout. And also, what is linguistic accommodation? What do we do when we accommodate another person linguistically? Dana?
We try to understand them.
Yeah, so that we switch to the kind of variety that the person is using to kind of like try to match the way we speak, right? So we accommodate people in other ways as well. Like if somebody smiles to you, you want to smile back. If somebody doesn't smile to you, then you don't want to smile back. And so that's accommodation as well. So we try to match the other person's way of speaking when we linguistically accommodate someone. The clearest, silliest example would be that we speak the language that is totally expected in the speech situation based on what language the participants know. And so that, you know, I don't come here and start lecturing to you in Finnish. That would not be very accommodating, right? And even, you know, in another language, if I knew Spanish well enough in order to be able to lecture in Spanish, it's also this situation that it wouldn't be the expected language in an American auditorium at our specific university unless we are in a foreign language class. And then when your foreign language teacher speak to you, ask a question in Spanish, German, French, whatever language you're taking, you would be replying in that variety, linguistic variety, to accommodate the question, right? So that's a relatively simple topic. Linguistic landscapes I think this is fascinating, and this would be an interesting topic for a presentation. For instance, on page 85, you've got a couple of pictures. Now, keep in mind when you read this book that Janet Fuller has worked a lot on German, different kinds of varieties of German code switching, multilingual discourse, and that is her area. So we have a lot of examples from German, and so on page 87 there are a couple of pictures taken from Germany, and these are referred to this as linguistic landscapes. And the linguistic landscape is just simply what languages do we see when we look around, or look around. here in Huntsville, what are the languages that you expect to see in signs, for instance? Well, obviously English, but anything else? Yeah?
Spanish.
Yes, we see a lot of Spanish. If you go, you don't have to leave our building here. If you see, you can see some signs. Most signs are probably in English, but then, like for instance, wet floor is in both languages, in English and in Spanish. So that's our linguistic landscape. And what does it tell? That particular sign is in, a multilingual sign, a bilingual sign. That's something, we can speculate about. But we don't have to go far in order to start seeing other languages in the linguistic landscape. If you go to Houston, what other languages will you see there in the signs?
You see them in Vietnamese too.
What is that?
Vietnamese.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
inside the buses, they'll have it in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and occasionally Mandarin.
Yes, exactly. And in some neighborhoods, you can see Korean, you can see Chinese, Vietnamese. Absolutely. Houston is the 4th largest city in the U.S. and exactly, it's like an hour away from us. And it's interesting that we go there and we start seeing many more languages in the linguistic landscape. So what does it tell? Where are those signs? What does it signify? Of course, some answers are really simple. That in that particular neighborhood there might be a lot of people coming from that particular country, and that's why we see those signs. But it's also a type of linguistic accommodation that we are admitting. Yes, we have people from other places, and we welcome these people, and that's why we have the signs there. The opposite is also true, that if we don't see signs, then maybe there isn't a large enough group or what have you. And these questions are sometimes they are like decided within the city councils and those kinds of. Yes.
I have a question. So how on bathroom signs they have Braille, would that count? Even though they don't really no one speaks Braille, it's just understanding it. It's still in English they register it as English, but it's just bumps.
In where?
Bathroom signs, how they have Braille, the bump.
Yes, right. And in which particular situation are you thinking about?
How blind people they use the Braille to figure out if it's a bathroom or not. Or,
yes, right. So it's science. That's a really great observation. And don't we have here in Evans as well? When you leave this space, check it out. I think we have Braille, and of course, if we don't need to resort to Braille, then that is totally linguistic landscape as well. If we don't have to resort to it, then it's just kind of like we don't even notice. I'm like, do we have it here? So check it out. Check it out. That's an excellent question. Yes. Yeah. So in certain countries which are, and I'm drawing from my old country, Finland, which is a bilingual country. Finnish is a majority language, and then there's 5% minority of Swedish speakers, and it is determined whether the street signs have to be bilingual or not. If a city or town has a certain number of minority speakers, which is Swedish speakers, then there has to be, both. It has to be, the signs have to be bilingual. If there are a certain number of a percentage of Swedish speakers, minority speakers, if it's like a majority language in a particular town, even though in the country it's a minority language, then the order you would put Swedish first and then Finnish. So that tells a lot about, okay, we acknowledge that this is the case. Yes. And that Braille thing was an excellent observation. Very good.
Also here in Houston, like in Bel Air,
Yes.
the street signs are in Mandarin, and then on the side they have it in English.
Yes. Yes, I've noticed the same thing. Same thing in that neighborhood. Is it Mandarin or Korean?
It's Mandarin.
It's Mandarin. Okay. Yes. So there's a concentration of speakers of Mandarin or Chinese speakers who can read that particular script, and that's when we have a lot of people. Yes, the society wants to accommodate. Same thing with the Braille. So there's this intention to accommodate. Yeah. Okay, so if you can turn to page 107. And this is a piece of discourse, and it's an English-German piece of discourse. It is, some of you may have listened to it already because it's under that link about, like extra materials for the chapters. So the transcript is from pages 107 to 109, and I also want you to look at this because this is the kind of a transcript that you will be doing. Doesn't have to be bilingual, of course, your transcription assignment later on, but it gives you an idea that what we have in a transcription assignment, we indicate who the speakers are. In this particular case, it's S and H, and then on the side you will put the lines and break the conversation so that it's not just like one paragraph. And we'll talk much more about the conventions of doing transcriptions once we get closer to that one. But here's the recording on which the transcription here is based. So the quality is not like perfect, but it's good enough when you have the transcription in front of you. So you can follow in your book while you listen.
That is what I did. I got my eyes checked.
Oh,
and my eyes are worse now. In the last few years, they've gotten worse. Especially the right eye. So my right eye has gotten much worse. And I need a new laser, right? And it's the same man that I know from 1990, 1989.
So was bei den Brillen?
Brillenwerkstatt, wo ich meine Brille, wo ich die habe dann eigentlich. Und sagte, das kostet 300 Mark mit Krankenversicherung. Auch. Ich muss das 300 bezahlen.
Was kostet die Krankenversicherung 300 Mark?
Die neue Gläser für diese Brille.
Hat er gesagt?
Ja, wir haben alles ausgerechnet. Ich war da mindestens 1,5 Stunden. Er hat alles geprüft, meine Augen, alle verschiedenen Maschinen, die Stigmatismus, alle Sachen.
Aber der muss fast das Mal auch angehen, oder? Ja. Weil der das verschreiben muss, wenn du was in der Krankenkasse haben willst. Geht nicht so, dass nur der Optiker macht.
Doch, ja. Das ist so auch so, wie ich meine Brille gekriegt habe.
Du warst da Angst beim Augenarzt?
Nee, nie. Nee, du musst nie da. Er prüft alles da, die haben alles da. Die sind ganz super, der Laden. Ich war da schon ein paar Mal. Ich kenne die auch. Ich kenne den Typ.
Ich wäre da irgendwie skeptisch.
No,
weil der hat eine medizinische Ausbildung.
Ich war beim Augenarzt, ich kenne das auch. Die machen nichts anderes. Die machen dieselben Tests und so. Aber das Problem ist, dass ich brauche 300 Mark nächsten Montag. Kannst du mir das ausleihen?
Du kriegst schon eine neue Brille jetzt, oder was?
Ja.
Aha.
Ich habe die bestellt.
Tatsächlich?
Ja, voll gut, meine Augen sind schlechter. Was soll ich tun? Ich renne blind durch die Gegend.
Aber du sagst, du siehst immer so viel.
No, can you loan me 300 mark?
Natürlich.
Do you have that? I thought you had nothing on your console.
Ja, ich nehme das schon gefragt.
Geht das? Ist das kein Problem?
Kein Problem.
Okay, that's what I want to know. All your other comments are unnecessary.
Bla bla bla.
So anyway, it's a good thing to go because I've been having headaches.
Okay. That's where it stops. It wasn't the entire transcript. Okay, so what is the speech situation? Who are these people who are talking to each other? An American girl and her German boyfriend, right? And they are in Germany, and this is Sarah and Hans, new glasses. It's a couple in their early mid-20s. They have been together for about 2 years. This is on page 106. They are currently living together temporarily while Sarah looks for a new apartment. Sarah has a German mother who, but she grew up in the United States, and she spoke some German growing up, but her dominant language is English. And she has lived in Germany for about 3 years now. She seems to be totally fluent, right? And Hans has lived always in Germany, and German is his dominant language. He speaks English as a foreign language and has learned it in school. And up until recently, Sarah and Hans almost always spoke German together, but at the time of the recording, Hans was going to be leaving soon for a semester as an exchange student to the United States. And Sarah has been speaking English to him because, as she told the researcher who collected this data, she felt he needed to work on his English. So this is the situation. This is the rough situation, who the participants are and where they are and what their languages are. So is there anything you notice in the transcript that German words are in bold, the English is in plain font, and then of course everything that is in German, it has been translated into English right below. So when you listen to this, it's difficult to kind of get the intonations, the tones of voice, but when you hear the original recording, then you can see that at one point there's this aggravated part where Sarah becomes kind of aggravated. Why does she become aggravated?
I don't have the book right now, so I was just listening. But I heard that she was saying that he didn't have to say certain comments. and it
Exactly.
kind of upset her.
Exactly. She thought he didn't have to say these comments that he said. And yes.
Sorry, I just found it interesting that, like, I don't have the book either, so I was just listening.
Yeah.
But I noticed that as she got aggravated, she switched to his language to yell at him. Which
Yeah.
I found interesting, because normally when you're angry, you just want to, like, not have to filter from, like, English to another language.
Yes.
But she wanted to accommodate him, I guess.
Right, yes, that I am in a position where I know your code, I can speak your code, so I'm not like maybe below you, I guess. It's a difficult situation because Sarah needs Hans for these 300 euros, which the glasses cost. So she needs to be persuasive without aggravating him, but it seems that she's pretty close, right?
I like how she had an attitude more in English, like she was like, and anyways, like he wouldn't know that as a non-English, like he doesn't speak English well enough to know that that specific way of saying that phrase is a whole attitude.
It is. It shows attitude. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes. I think they didn't include the rest of the conversation here because I don't know if they were, because they call each other names affectionately there, but you know, people have become so skirmish about any, you know, slang words for non-endearment. But anyway, so they are kind of, you know, going back and forth. I mean, not really, because how much English does Hans speak in this little exchange?
I didn't even hear him speak English. But if he did, it wasn't that much.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think he uses any English really, so he is not like linguistically accommodating to Sarah, but then that was their past, that they had gotten into the habit of speaking German because she was better in German than he was in English. So that has to be taken into consideration. It's more interesting here is, why do you think Sarah switches to German after, you know, she says I need new Gläser, lenses, and uses just that one word. This is on line 3 under 3. So one word taken from German, and that's what is typically called intrasentential code switching, that you put another language word into intersentential code switching, that you switch inside a sentence, that you put one other language word into the frame of the other language, often called the matrix language, according to this researcher, very famous in code switching area, whose name is Carol Myers-Cotton, and she introduced these terms of matrix language and embedded language. So according to her terms, other terms are used as well, but this would be German as the matrix language on line 3. I mean English as the matrix language on line 3, and then German is the embedded language with only one word. But then on line 6, line 4, Hans just says mm-hmm. And Sarah continues the explanation, and it's the same man that I know from 1990 and 1989. And Hans continues normally in his language, in German on line 6, and then on line 7, Sarah switches to German. So this would be called intersentential code switching, because she switches from her earlier turn from one sentence completely to another sentence completely in German. Intersentential code switching. Okay.
Can you say it again, please?
Yep.
Can you say it again, please?
The definition.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Can you say the definition again, please?
So the intersentential code switching, yes. When a bilingual switches, says one sentence in say for instance in English, and then switches to Spanish for the next sentence or next utterance, that would be called intersentential code switching. So as in contrast to intrasentential code switching, which is within the sentence, intersentential between sentences. Good point to clarify. Yes. So if you look at this, you can probably see a lot of different things, and I gave you another piece of discourse. If we have time, we'll look at that later today or the next time. But there is a lot to be said about the choice of language. Who is talking which language to whom, when and where and why. This particular example did not give any instances where Hans would have been speaking English, and it would be interesting to know whether, what he reserves English for in their conversation. So last time, if we move on here or go back to where we were, last time we were looking at the speech situation. And this chart, as I mentioned, is an old chart, but it's the best compilation of the different kinds of situational factors that affect both bilingual language choice, but also monolingual language choice. So if you don't hang around with bilingual people who code switch all the time, you do hang around with people who know more than one dialect, and that can also be explained according to the same theory in principle. So we started looking at this last time. So we've got the situation divided into the scene and participants, the scene into the setting and purpose. I think we covered already bystanders and locale and time. The locale here, we are in Evans 105. We speak in a certain kind of a manner. We meet each other outside of Evans 105, and we speak a little bit differently to each other at that time. Time is another factor. Morning discussions tend to be a little bit different from afternoon discussions. I have already mentioned that Friday afternoon classes are the most talkative classes just because of the time. Everybody is ready to start the weekend, and everybody tends to be kind of like happy and rowdy. So purpose of the conversation activity type, what are the goals, and what are the activated roles in that particular situation. So your activated role in this particular speech situation is what? Student, exactly. And my activated role is the professor. Subject matter, that affects how we speak, the task, and the topic affect how we speak. So that's pretty all of this is very self-explanatory, but somebody had to put it on paper. So participants, we can look at the participants as individual participants, and there we can look at individual as an individual, as opposed to an individual as a member of a category. Because into every speech situation we bring these both aspects too. So individual as an individual, what are your stable features? What's your personality? What are your interests? What is your physical appearance? And that somehow, we can't get rid of these things. We bring these things into the speech situation. And I don't particularly often think about the fact that I am a relatively short woman, and I started thinking about that when I was chairing the department and had to be in a lot of meetings with tall men. So my physical appearance was kind of like, oh, she's the short woman. Of course they wouldn't. I'm not blaming my colleagues for that, but I felt it myself, and I usually wore high heels to get those critical 2 inches to bring a little bit more oomph to my opinions. So silly, very silly example, but we can, we can help who we are, and we bring that into the speech situation. And sometimes it affects the speech situation, sometimes it doesn't. Have you noticed anything in particular speech situations? Yes.
I've noticed with like the height thing.
Yeah.
When like you're hanging, like you're talking to someone you don't really know, you tend to stand so you can like, I don't know, like have that difference of like height. But when you're like talking to a friend in like a group or something, you all sit down, so you're almost equal.
Yes. Right. So yeah. So and sometimes it's totally like subconscious. We don't think about it, but yeah. Yes. Yeah. But these encounters that people have with people who don't necessarily know you, they just look at you, and I mean, it's, news are full of very tragic situations where people have been judged based on how they look. Still, or how they, basically how they look, and have been treated badly. Happens all the time. So in that sense, my being a short woman is a very trivial thing, but it does affect the way we then try to present ourselves. Maybe trying to accommodate, those kinds of things. Okay, but personality, people have different personalities, and they bring those factors also into the speech situation. Some people are more talkative, some people are more quiet, and those other tend to be the stable features. Temporary features are moods and emotions and attitudes. And they also affect how we speak. If you're tired, you kind of speak more slowly and not as enthusiastically, and it shows. Emotions, if you're angry, we could hear on that little bilingual exchange between Sarah and Hans that Sarah was getting angry at one point, and we heard it in her tone of voice. Attitudes, of course, they are temporary features, and more or less temporary features. They affect how we speak. But like attitudes, political attitudes, for instance, in today's world where the United States is kind of divided in terms of political affiliations, we don't have to speak long with a person in order to see whether this person is, agreeing or disagreeing with our particular views. It shows in the language also, not just in the words, but in the way people speak and react and so on. Okay, then we as individuals, we are also members of a social category. That's the social class, or ethnicity, or sex, or age. And again, my very trivial example about my being a woman in a group of men, very often you kind of like try to get your word in edgewise if the people are very dominant, if the other people are dominant, and there's been a lot of research on that. Interestingly, men tend to say that women interrupt more, and women tend to say that men interrupt more, but But that all kind of like depends on whether it's really interruption, like I don't want you to talk, or whether it's back channeling, like I agree how you talk, and I agree with you so much that I can even finish your sentence because I know what you're thinking. But anyway, that's a different. When we get to the discourse chapter, we'll talk more about that. Yeah, okay. Then relationships between participants, it affects how we speak, interpersonal relations, whether you like a person, whether you know a person, you speak differently. Of course we speak differently to people you know than to people you don't know. And isn't it interesting that we sometimes meet somebody and we kind of, whom we haven't met before, we kind of know whether that person likes us or not by how far they are from us or want to position themselves, but basically how they speak. So do they like me? You sometimes come from like, for instance, a job interview, and people ask, so how did it go? And you may say, I think they liked me, or I think they didn't like me. So we get those in, those subtle. Of course, nobody says, I don't like you, oh, I really like you, not immediately. So we pick up those little cues from how they speak to us. Then the role and category of relations. What are our roles? Are either the activated roles in this very specific speech situation, or how we are perceived. Like if you just think about your boss, your professor, your minister, if you speak to a minister, you kind of, that person brings that role to that particular relationship, and then, we choose our language accordingly. And social power, social status in group versus not part of our group. It shows, like, is this a person who is a like-minded person from my own in-group? We will speak differently than to somebody who is not part of that in-group. And those are really subtle things, and basically, you can pick up any one of these features and kind of like build a little research project around it, and kind of like start your observations and see how things go. Okay, so now we have finished this one. I did want to talk a little bit, actually I'm gonna skip this one. This is about William Labov's department store study about the Armlessness in New York. Well, let me talk about it quickly. So this is the so-called Armlessness in New York City study by William Labov, and you may have heard about it at some other context, but it was a groundbreaking study because what Labov showed in this particular study, that there are these intersections of different alignments of people. The same person in the same situation chooses the words differently because there's still variation and different things need to be taken into account. So he came up with this study several decades ago, where in New York, of course, we have this notion that in New York people do not say the post-vocalic R, so people skip it, and so New York is New York without the that's the stereotype, right, of people in New York, that they drop the post-vocalic R. But Labov was able to show that it's much more intricate, much more complex than just a geographical feature. So yes, in that phenomenon happens in New York, that people often drop their R's, but he was interested in the variation within the dropping of the R's. So he went to 3 different kinds of department stores, Saks, Macy's, and S. Klein, and these are kind of like hierarchically staggered according to their social prestige. Saks is very expensive, something like what Neiman Marcus here in Texas, right? Macy's is like, you know, Dillard's, or yeah, Dillard's is probably similar kind. S. Klein is like, you know, Walmart or Kmart. So you get the social stratification of customers who go to these different department stores. That's what the hypothesis was based on. S. Klein doesn't exist anymore, and I was just reading that Macy's is kind of, is that, I don't know. But anyway, so he went there and he wanted to study the post-vocalic R. Now, this was before the IRB protocols were implemented, so he could just go there and start his study without clearing it with, you know, with people asking for consent forms and so on. Now we have to do that. And so he was able to kind of like overcome that observer's paradox that we talked about, that he just went there and made notes of what people said without first saying that I am going to study your language. Could you please write your name in the consent form? Today we would have to do that, but this was done such a long time ago. And the consent form, it kind of like tends to spoil a little bit about the goals of the study. It has to be worded so that it's ethical and honest, therefore ethical, but that you wouldn't say that I'm going to study the post-vocalic R, because then, you know, people would be mindful of not leaving any of the R's out, because it is a stereotype. Okay, so his hypothesis was that in these 3 different department stores, there will be more post-vocalic R's pronounced at Saks than at S. Klein, because the dropping of the post-vocalic R is a feature of, he hypothesized, maybe the feature of more working class groups, rather than, you know, of course this was also based on the idea that the sales clerks would be accommodating to their customers' social status, social class. Okay, so whether that is necessarily so or not, but you know, his findings were quite convincing, and that's why this became a classic study. So he goes to the department stores, and he has a piece of paper in his pocket and a pencil and his notebook, but he doesn't show them immediately. He goes to the sales clerk. First he finds out where men's ties, for instance, are sold in that particular department. Oh, what is sold on 4th floor? So that was the key. He wanted to elicit the answer 4th floor, because it can be said with the post-vocalic R's like 4th floor, okay, or without the R's, 4th floor, or with a combination, 4th floor or 4th floor. So you basically have those combinations. And he was interested in the pronunciation, because he wanted to study what it's, you know, connected with. And so he goes to the sales clerk and says, excuse me, where are men's ties? And the clerk would say either 4th floor with the R's, or 4th floor, or a combination. And then Labov pretended to be hard of hearing and pretended not to have heard it. And he said, oh, excuse me, could you say it again? And the person repeated it. And then he said, thank you, and turned away and made his little notes behind the corner of how the pronunciation went. So what he found was that during the first question to where are men's thighs, at Sachs, 63% of the possible R's were pronounced, 44% at Macy's, and at S. Klein, 8% of the R's were. So at S. Klein, Kmart, Walmart, very few people actually pronounce the R's, right? And then in the more careful style, the R's, what happened to the R's? Did they increase or decrease? Increased in all categories, in all socially hierarchically ordered categories. So, of course, at Sachs, we are in New York, and a lot of people in New York do not pronounce the post-vocalic R's often or always. So it was a small increase from 63% to 64%, but at Macy's it was a significant increase from 44% to 61%, and at S. Klein also there was an increase, but in the careful speech only 18% of the R's were pronounced. So how would you combine the findings here? We're looking at a regional feature of dropping the post-vocalic R's. We are also looking at the social language user, the dialect feature of of the social class feature. So region, social class, and what was Labov's main contribution was that this is dependent on the speech situation. We cannot make this generalization that in New York people don't pronounce the post-vocalic R's. And we cannot say that at higher socioeconomic groups people pronounce the post-vocalic R's, and in lower groups they do not pronounce the post-vocalic R's. We cannot make these kinds of generalizations. Why this study is always cited, especially in sociolinguistics textbooks, is because it was so insightful that he underscored this first the intersectionality of social class and region, and then also that situation is what actually ultimately determines how many R's there will be in in these exchanges. So it was an interesting study, and it very kind of like underscoring from casual to careful style. That's a different speech situation, even though the overall situation, of course, was the same. That you are in the participants were the same, and so on. But okay, so we have already talked about overt versus covert prestige. Standard. This is, and I'll send this PowerPoint to you. Actually, I sent this already last week, but I'll send it again or post it again on Blackboard. So standard dialects, they tend to have overt prestige, and non-standard dialects, they also have prestige, but it's called covert prestige, and that's among the speakers of those dialects. Whereas standard dialects have like societal prestige. Peter Trudgill is an English sociolinguist, and he's another one who has done one of these very groundbreaking, interesting classic studies, and he did his study on differences between middle class women and working class men in England. So we're looking at two different social classes and two different genders. So what he found was that 3 factors influence speech. It's person's sex, whether, and this is in the 1970s, so you could still talk about men and women. But that is one feature, and it would be probably not accurate to say that that has nothing to do with how people speak. It does have. So, and then we can use those features in order to send messages that this is not a binary thing. It's on a continuum. So socioeconomic status, again, this is not necessarily a completely binary thing, but it still is a powerful explanatory factor to how people may speak. And age, so these were the important factors: sex, socioeconomic status, and age. So these are the situational features. They are part of that situational feature chart that we looked at just a few minutes ago. What he found was that middle-class women aspired to overt prestige varieties, that is standard varieties, and working-class men and younger working-class women, they aspired to covert prestige varieties, like non-standard varieties. So just as a silly example, a quick example, something like the use of a double negative. Middle-class women, they aspired to, avoiding saying something like, I never have no money, okay? And working-class men, they aspired for the double negatives because there's something, I don't want to say macho, but macho kind of captures what I have in mind here, that there's something honest, something down to earth, something strong about the use of the double negative as opposed to the standard form. And interestingly, younger working class women aspired to the same. So even though they were women, but because they were younger and working class, they wanted to align with the working class men. And another thing is, I don't know about this, like for instance, swearing using cuss words. 100 years ago, a woman using cuss words would have been a rarity, but hasn't it kind of like increased nowadays? So why are women using the cuss words?
I mean, kind of now we have this movement where we deserve to be at the same level as any man.
Exactly, and that's a very clear way of kind of like asserting yourself that I'm not a fragile, flowery thing. I'm not, feminine. I have, the ability to speak like a guy, right? And this is another. Of course, these things kind of, this study was done 50 years ago, so things change and attitudes change and worldviews change. But still, if you think of sex, socioeconomic status, age, they still probably explain part of the linguistic variation. Or if there's been a change, the change reflects the change in society, and we talked about that quite a bit earlier. So let's talk now. We've got 5 minutes left, a little bit about language contact. We've already talked about it, but more formally here. So languages come into contact always when speakers come into contact. You have to bring speakers into contact with one another in order to bring their languages into contact. And languages can also come into contact. So for instance, in a situation where there's a lot of immigration or movement within different countries, different groups of different speakers, even within one country. Dialects also come into contact with each other. So languages come into contact also in language classrooms. If you think about a foreign language, we don't have to. We can bring our language into contact with Spanish in a Spanish classroom without knowing a single speaker, a native speaker of Spanish. See what I mean? And we can also study Spanish in a place where you can never ever meet a speaker of Spanish. So language classrooms are also places where when a foreign language is studied in a faraway place, those languages still come into contact. I remember, growing up in Finland, we had to study being, coming from a small country with only 5 million speakers. You have to study several foreign languages if you want to open certain doors. And I remember, we never saw any people who were from almost never, who were from another country. But we started using, like in our, my friends and I, we were kind of like starting to mix English into our Finnish, Swedish, German, what language we were studying. We added those. So languages do come into contact under those very restricted situations. We already mentioned that two languages, when they come into contact, they start to influence each other at linguistic levels. Lexicon is the easiest to notice. We borrow words, phrases, idiomatic expressions. Calques are certain special kinds of translations, like when you have an idiom in one language, and if you translate it word to word into the other language, that's called a calque. So the German word Kettenraucher is a calque of the English chain smoker, and it was built on the English concept of chain smoker, just literal translation. English worldview is a calque of German, can go the other way around as well. The German Weltanschauung translates literally into world view. And these are just, two quick examples. So loan words start coming into language under language contact situation. And the wonderful semantic field of loan words that we have gotten from Spanish is, for instance, all the wonderful foods that we have borrowed, that have been introduced from specifically from Mexico. We have the burritos and tacos and enchiladas, and our, not only our language but our culture, our culinary culture would be much poorer if we didn't have those. So that's what can happen under language contact. But what is also important is that sometimes the structure can change under language contact. And I already talked about that when I talked about how under the Viking influence, English case systems started to simplify. So structural borrowing requires the existence of bilingualism. People have to know each other's languages to an extent. Okay, we're going to finish there, and I'll send this to you and we'll go over the rest of it next time. And if you could please bring the handouts that I gave to you next time. can read them kind of like so as a basis for discussion. Okay, have a good rest of the day. Bye.